So, my name is Antonia Harris. This is for Anatomy and Physiology at Grand Canyon University, and I chose to talk about Boyle's Law and how it relates to ventilation when it comes to this respiratory presentation. So, Boyle's Law just states that the principle that for relatively low pressures, so for relatively low pressures, the pressure of an ideal gas kept at a constant temperature varies inversely with the volume of the gas. So Boyle's law originally is named after Robert Boyle, and that was back in 1839. It is also known as Mariotti's law. And then this diagram here is just showing kind of like an example of Boyle's law. So as you can see, on this side, it's the same amount of volume as on the other side. However, there's more space, so there's less pressure. So less pressure and same amount of volume. But then on the other side, they increase the pressure, which increases the volume, which decrease the volume. I'm sorry. So they basically close down on it, and then that decreased the volume of the substance or whatever you want to call it, and increased pressure decreases the volume, decreased pressure increases the volume. That's basically all it's saying. Another way to state that is for a fixed amount of an ideal gas kept at a fixed temperature, pressure and volume are inversely proportional. So, like I said, decreased pressure, increased volume, increased pressure, decreased volume. That's essentially Boyle's law. So then how it relates to pulmonary ventilation. So ventilation is also known as basically breathing, and it deals with the contraction and relaxation of the lungs and diaphragm. So, well, really it deals with the contraction and relaxation of the muscles around the lungs, essentially. And then, of course, your lungs will inflate and deflate accordingly based on the volume of air you intake. So, basically, the air volume changes in the air passages of the lungs during ventilation. So the volume of the lungs will change when the pressure of the air in the lungs change, which basically is Boyle's law. And if the pressure is increased inside the lungs, then outside the air goes out. So as you can see in this picture, it's just showing like the diaphragm. So when the air moves in, the diaphragm will contract and you're like inhaling. Your diaphragm contracts, your ribs expand, and your lungs expand. And then once you exhale, the air moves out, and then your diaphragm relaxes, goes back up basically, and then your ribs contract and your lungs compress. So that's just kind of like, I guess, an example of the two, so you can kind of compare and contrast. So on this part, I just pretty much put another picture basically explaining, and then I'll just pretty much explain. So in inspiration, which is also known as inhalation, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles is what is contracting, and then once the diaphragm contracts, it leads to an increase in the thoracic cavity size. So in the external intercostal muscle contraction leads to an elevation of the ribs and sternum. So basically, both of those activities lead to lung expansion. So, and once the lungs expand, that's just showing that there's an increase in the volume of the air inside the internal air passages. And so that also means that the air pressure inside the air pressure inside the lungs decreases below the air pressure outside of the lung, below the air outside of the body. So the gas moves from a higher pressure to a lower pressure than the air into the lungs, if that makes any sense. So, and then with exhalation or expiration, the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles play a part in this. But basically, instead of contracting, they relax. So it's the opposite. So basically, the fibers in the lung tissue is what causes the lungs to basically decrease or shrink back down to their original volume, and the pressure of the air inside of the lungs increases above the air pressure outside of the body, and that makes the air go out. So during higher rates of ventilation or faster or increased rates of ventilation, expiration is ran by the contraction of the expiratory muscles, which is just the diaphragm and the external intercostal muscles, as I stated before. So then this is just a link to like a real quick video, just kind of showing, if it will load. It might not. Basically just showing or describing, or not. Oops. Okay. Oh, intro. I might already have it pulled up. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. What am I doing? This is not it. Oh my gosh. You know what? This is probably it. Yeah, and I don't use that. So, back to Google. What is it doing? So this is just a quick minute and a half video, basically just going over the process that happens when you breathe. It's kind of telling you from like the beginning in regards to the rib cage, the lungs, and everything else. It's kind of going into like more detail and more depth of like what the lungs are doing, what the diaphragm is doing, the rib cage, and all that. I know I didn't talk about that, but because really the main focus is just the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles. So, but like I said, this is definitely going into more depth. It's definitely telling you about the pleural fluid, which is basically the surfactant that we talked about earlier this week in the class. And that's just to give that slip so there's not that friction. And yeah, I mean, and then this just now is going into actual what I talked about, which is inspiration, inhaling, and it's giving you a rundown of that basically, and basically a step by step over here on the side as it's talking. Letting you know what the ribs are doing, which essentially I guess is the diaphragm, because I mean, think of the human body, it kind of makes sense. Anyways, basically I mean, everybody can read, so now it's going into expiration or exhaling. Is giving you the rundown of what goes on with that, and how the diaphragm relaxes during exhalation. Ugh. And thoracic cavity volume decreases, pressure increases, the lungs contract, and then you breathe out essentially. And I mean, honestly, that's really just that. And then if I go back to the slideshow, so that was my little link, and then this all right. So this is just basically the links to my pictures where I got them from offline. I didn't want to leave that out because I know I left that out on my test, and I got points taken off of it, so I didn't know really if it was necessary to put it in on a presentation as well, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. So yeah, that's my presentation. That's that.